was a bassist in a group doing a tour of the clubs, Lara pubs in my local area, circa 1984/1985. One night, we played a club in my hometown, and the concert room was on the first floor of the building after the gig, and after all club members had left. We started to pack the amps, etc., away. There were only two access stairways to the first floor concert room, and one was being constantly used by the group members to ferry the amps, etc., to the van. On the other stairway was the proprietor of the premises, who was talking with our wives and waiting for us to finish loading up so he could lock the fire exit doors. During the loading of their amps, I decided to go to the toilet, this being at the other end of the concert room. I went to the toilet. The toilet layout itself consisted of opening the door, going down a passage, and then into the main area itself. I tried to find a light switch but couldn't, so I just went in. As I approached the urinal to do my stuff, I became aware of a male standing to the right of me in my peripheral vision. The only illumination at that time was from the sodium street lamps shining through the transom windows of the toilet. I turned to look and saw the following: white male 50 to 60-ish, grey-white well-groomed hair, medium build, handsome looking, wearing a grey suit, white shirt, black tie, black shoes. His hands were clasped at the front and he was smiling. He was standing next to the roller towel on the wall. As I looked at him, all he said was, "Good group." I interpreted this to mean that he thought our group had done a good gig that night. I smiled and said yes, but at the same time, I was feeling real uneasy. I looked forward but didn't look back at him. I finished off hurriedly, and I remember keeping my head down as I walked back to the passage to the exit. I can still remember seeing his legs whilst looking down. As I left, I went straight to my wife and to the proprietor and said that there was someone in the toilet. The proprietor said that that was impossible as he checked the toilet for any stragglers, and it had been a negative. I insisted that there was, and so, grabbing my wife's hand, I went back into the toilet, but there was no one there. This really spooked me. There was only one way, in or out of that toilet on the first floor concert room, and it had only been about 1.5 minutes since I had left the toilet. If the man had left, myself, plus everyone else would have seen him leave as the door was in plain view to all. He can't have slipped out then down the stairs, as both stairways were manned, for want of a better word. That's my story. Whether you believe it or not, it happened to me. As a postscript to this, if I can just say that a funeral director's premises were opposite the club, and still are, and whether this may have contributed to the events I don't know. It is interesting to note, however, that not long after this incident I left the group because of my career, yet I still stayed friends with the members. Some 2 years later, one of the members rang me to say they had played a gig in the same club and that the proprietor had remembered the group because of that incident. He had mentioned the incident to his manager, and his manager had said that the same incident regarding a male in the toilet had happened to another group's member sometime before my incident. A few years back, around 1991 or so, I lived in an apartment in Kentucky. I had a 6-month-old daughter. She and I were the only ones living here at this time. One night, the night before Easter, my mom called me and told me to make sure that I turned my answering machine off. So when she called the next morning to get me up for church, I would eventually hear the phone and get up. I checked the answering machine like 3 times before I went to bed. I put my daughter in her crib and gave her her bottle. She shared the room with me since we only had a 1-bedroom apartment. I woke up the next morning about 10 o'clock or so and realized that church had started about 30 minutes ago. I wondered why my mom didn't call me. I called her to see if she was okay. And of course, she had gone to church or wasn't home anyway. I went to the answering machine and it was on. I know just as sure as I am sitting here now that I turned it off. There is no way anyone could have gotten in the apartment. We have deadbolt locks and I had the only key. I checked the machine 3 times. I knew it was off when I went to sleep. I went into the kitchen to get a Coke, my morning brew, and there, on the floor of the kitchen, was my daughter's bottle broken into 100 pieces. The bottle was the kind that was flexible plastic, the kind you can step on and just bend it in, not shatter, so to speak. My daughter was only 6 months old and I know she couldn't have gotten out of her crib, let alone have the strength to crush the bottle in such a manner. A couple of years later, I met this guy that lived in the apartment complex with his mother. We started seeing each other and he later moved in with me. He had a friend that was really into stuff like going to graveyards in the middle of the night and the Ouija board and all. He came over one night and we decided to see if we could get anything to happen. He and my boyfriend were the ones doing it and I was coming up with the questions. I asked him to ask how many slats were on the mini blinds on the window. The board answered the exact number. I counted them after the number was given. Not really believing at this point, I got a handful of spaghetti and broke it several times. Put it in a cup and turned the cup upside down on the bar and had him ask how many pieces were under the cup. The board answered just 2 numbers shy of the exact amount. Again, I counted after the number was given. I thought still, it was hard to believe until I looked on the floor and saw 2 pieces I had dropped. I have grown up quite a bit now and don't really dabble in stuff like that anymore. I would like to have a very nice ghost in the house now. One that was protective, so to speak, but I guess I just don't live in a spooky place now. I really don't remember how old I was at the time, but I don't think I was more than about 9 years old. That would put the time of this somewhere during the summer of 1984. My grandparents lived out in the country, about a 15-minute drive from home. I was spending the weekend with my grandparents. The story that follows occurred on the Friday night of that weekend. It was after dark. I was on the couch, turned around and sitting on my knees, looking out a large picture window. I was waiting on Grandpa to get home from work. Grandma and I were the only 2 people in there at the time. As I waited, a dense fog began to form. The fog began to grow thicker as time passed. Grandma was getting a bit worried. Grandpa was late getting home, and she was afraid he'd have an accident due to low visibility brought on by the fog. Several more minutes passed. I was still kneeling on the couch, watching out the window for Grandpa. Then I saw what looked like 2 lights coming up the road toward the house. At first, I thought the lights were from the headlights on Grandpa's car. Then I realized that the lights were not the right color. One light seemed to be a lemon yellow, while the other appeared pink. I watched, curious, as the lights moved closer. Then I yelled for Grandma to come to the window and look at them. Grandma was busy preparing supper and didn't want to leave the kitchen. I took another look at the lights, which were still moving closer, and then went to the kitchen to try to convince Grandma to come and see them. At this point, the lights were still not much more than fuzzy-colored blobs due to the thick fog. I left the window and ran into the kitchen. I told Grandma that there was a pair of lights approaching the house. She said something along the lines of, "Good. He's finally home." I told her that the lights didn't look like they were from a car. I told her about the odd coloration. Finally, Grandma agreed to go, take a look for herself. Running, I got to the window before Grandma did. I resumed my former kneeling position on the couch before really looking out the window. The lights were still there, closer than before. They were just starting to take on a more definite shape, like something was emerging from the fog. Grandma leaned forward for a closer look at the solidifying shapes. I turned to her, asking what the lights were. She didn't know and was beginning to act a bit scared by the sight. I turned back to the window. The strange lights were almost to the house by that point. Thinking back now, I realized just how bright they must have been to have been visible at first. Then the lights finally took on a more tangible shape. This is the part that really makes me doubt what we thought we saw. What we saw looked to be two cows, both bulls, dancing along the road on their hind legs. No, this is not a joke. One was glowing yellow, the other was glowing pink. Each of the bulls had a front leg arm draped over the shoulder of the other. They were heading toward the driveway. At this point, Grandma fainted. I only remember giving her a quick look as she collapsed beside me on the couch. Then I resumed staring in disbelief and shock at the sight outside. The bulls danced along until they got to the driveway, turned as if to make their way up it to the house. Then both just faded away. After some time, I'm not sure how long exactly, but I don't think it was more than a minute or so, I turned away from the window to Grandma. She was still unconscious. I had no idea how to revive her. I remember shaking her, as if trying to wake a sleeping person, and talking to her. I do not recall what I said. After a few moments, she began to stir. As Grandma woke up, she turned quickly back to the window. I told her that whatever we had seen was gone. I asked her, what had we seen? Grandma sat me down on the couch and told me that I was not to breathe a word of what had happened to Grandpa when he got home. I asked why. Grandma wouldn't give me an answer. She just kept telling me to keep quiet about it. A few minutes later, we heard a car door slam outside. Grandpa was home. Again, Grandma warned me not to say a word to Grandpa about what had happened. Naturally, the moment Grandpa entered the house, I ran straight to him and told him everything that had happened. Grandpa spared only a second to ask Grandma if she were okay. The moment she said yes, Grandpa retrieved his shotgun and went outside. Grandma began to scold me very loudly for disobeying her orders. Several minutes later, Grandpa came back in. He had found nothing. To this day, neither of them will discuss what happened that evening. If that had been the end of the matter, I would have convinced myself years and years ago that both Grandma and I had simply been hallucinating. In fact, not too long after the incident, I had convinced myself of that. Several years after seeing the bulls at my grandparents' house, A friend of mine who I grew up with came to me one day with a story. I'll call this girl Allison. Both she and I were about 12 when she told me this. This girl's grandparents had lived directly behind us. Allison lived mostly with her grandparents during the summer months. Only a one-lane alley separated our 2 yards. Across this girl's grandparents' yard was the railroad bed I've posted about a few times in the past. On the other side of the railroad bed was a small farm. We lived at the very edge of town. Allison came to me one day saying that she had seen something very strange the previous night. I asked her what she'd seen. Allison made a long speech about how I'd think she was crazy if she told me. I pointed out that she'd already brought up the subject, so obviously she wanted to tell me. Allison agreed. She said that late the night before, she had been unable to sleep and had been looking out of her bedroom window. It began to get foggy. In the fog, Allison claimed to have seen 2 glowing lights moving across the pasture back at the farm. One light was yellow, the other pink. Please keep in mind that I had not told anyone about what Grandma and I had seen at this point. Allison said that as the lights got closer to the railroad bed, they began to take on solid shapes. At that point, I was starting to get cold chills. Allison said that she must have been seeing things and that she wouldn't waste time telling me the rest of her story. I insisted that she did. After a few minutes, Allison said, almost in tears, that the lights took on the shapes of cows, bulls. Each bull had a front leg draped over the shoulders of the other. Both appeared to be dancing along on their hind legs. They were moving toward the railroad bed, toward Allison's grandparents' house. Allison said that at that point she had turned away from her window and hid under the blankets until morning. After Allison told me her story, I told her my own, very similar one. As far as I know, Allison never saw the bulls again after that night. I've never seen them again myself. If not for Allison's story, I would have long since come to believe that what Grandma and I had seen was a hallucination brought on by the dense fog and car headlights or something like that. Allison's story makes me think again. I don't know what we saw, but I do know that we saw something. Anyone have any ideas?